Did you pray today? I can get down on some gang. Did you pray to get down on the gang?
Indirectly, a subtle way how Jesus came to be God, whether he made statements to indicate himself or other people react in a certain way, where it just gives off that notion that Jesus has affirmed his divinity. There are a couple of instances where within the Bible itself it talks about how people reacted, and it's always done in a manner where it's pretty evident. And just to focus on Mark 14, the person that is evaluating Christ is literally asking him if you're that same God or the same Christ that you claim to be. And so rather than saying a yes because God chose to do this specific manner, where he grabs Daniel, right, an Old Testament basically prophecy was going to be happening in the future, he is affirming that he is going to be exactly that Son of Man that's talking about there, which is at even in the Old Testament, adopting that identity because that's who he is, that's who he embodies, and is going to be on the clouds. So not only is he saying yes, it's yes and more. So that's how exactly how he do so. And the visceral reaction immediately after that is that literally, well, this translation says rent, but just tearing the clothes is just significant because that's like a reaction of the person that was considered in such high regard to react this way, because in his perspective, in his mind, Jesus committed blasphemy. But what type of blasphemy we're talking about? The basic sin where this mere mortal claimed to be God, and this person obviously referring to Jesus. And there's so many instances of these Jews reacting this way, whether it was in John 5, right, that I talked about a little bit earlier, John 8, right, and there's like a couple more that you can cite, but they always react in a certain way because if you think about it, specifically in John 8, Jesus makes it to be known that if you were to actually love God and love the Father, you will love me. And so he's actually proving them that they are literally of the devil, because all the devil wanted to do was just from the get-go wanted to destroy Jesus. It's just kind of expected for these Jews to essentially just go after Christ from beginning to end, and then every time where Christ was doing these miracles and obviously he was building up his recognition to such a high degree that the Jews can no longer ignore it. They had to do something, and so each passing day they just had a more of a bloodlust and a bloodthirsty for basically Jesus, which is something that God commanded to do, right? You shouldn't consume blood. I would say it's both a literal and also a figure of speaking, because it kind of reminds me of my past, right? It kind of spoke to me in a sense where I was used to be an aggressive person. Instinct of anger that just kind of boils within me. It felt super unnatural, even like tapping into it now, you know, like it's something that's like, it's like a long process to get such a degree to basically ask the death for somebody who didn't do anything wrong. Literally, Jesus did not do anything to warrant his death. And this type of recognition can expand in a couple of ways. Easy to miss, hard to basically put it into words, because, you know, there's a lot of like interpretation that's going on here, which is a lot of issue. You know, a lot of people unfortunately are biblically illiterate, including myself when I was like a year or so in. Now I'm like 3 years in, so I got like a much more firm understanding, because daily I read or just like get into my notes, look, and God always like provides and helps me correct some doctrinal errors. But there are certain subtleties when it comes to it, and it's very easy to miss. But the only way you can basically see it is when you get help with the Holy Spirit. And so one of those instances is basically in John 4, right, where Jesus is speaking to the Samaritan woman, and as he is subtly indicating that he is the God is coming, more so using the words. Notice how Jesus is talking about the Messiah is coming, but the Samaritan women basically is telling, like, I know you're talking about God. Okay, so it looks like at face value they're talking about two things. These two persons, Jesus and the Samaritan woman, are basically talking about the same thing, just like how the Son and the Father are the same being, this messianic figure and also this divine being God, are also one and the same. So they're not having two conversations or some miscommunication or misunderstanding. They're actually understanding that somebody who is outside of this nation of Israel understands the Jews' scriptures well, to the point that she knew what was Jesus indicating in this conversation. And so the issue really stems here is that even the Jews themselves, there was like certain sections of the Jewish with different ideas and thought. Even though they knew their scriptures well, they didn't know God well, which is a huge difference. You know, you can know everything from beginning to end, but when the actual being that the Jews worship comes into, completely went over the head and they missed the mark, just because they were more familiar and focused on the wrong things, because they sought the things of God, but they didn't do the things for God, by God. They just basically just lose the heart and the essence of everything was God breathed. And it's a very unfortunate, you know, you can get very technical and legalistic, but then forget where you come from and how far did God go with the nation of Israel. And we see that immediately, especially at the next chapter, chapter 5 of John, where Christ really just challenges the Pharisees to basically evaluate their knowledge and their scriptures to prove themselves who he is before them, to see if they can finally understand what they're indicating. And really just the first 8 or so chapters of John, you can see that this constant notion of, did you know God personally? No. And it's not a surprise that comes from John, because John, compared to Matthew, Mark, and Luke, is basically much more personal. Like it's almost as if he was like there alongside Jesus much more intimately, to the point he's able to describe things more. That's why in compare and contrast with the synoptic gospels and John, sometimes like John is like it's an own area, just because it's described in 4 different perspectives, 2 are more similar but just kind of still in a different manner. However, with John, it's like almost like a sibling, right? Like, I grew with you for such a long time, and you're able to share these profound, intimate, and to even some degree some metaphysical aspects when it comes to the book of John. So if you don't honor me like you honor God, so basically worship, sing, praise, and all those things that come in between, when it comes to honoring and worshiping God, if they don't do the same thing to Christ, it's basically you're not actually honoring God at all, you know, whether it be the person of the Father or even the Son. And it just really ties back to basically Matthew, right? Matthew 22, right there, it starts off with the parable with the wedding. But if you go a little bit more further, the Pharisees have a tough time to basically say, you are just the son of David. And Jesus really poses this good rhetorical question, right? The rhetoric is going, how can David, his own God, if he addresses God? It just becomes confusing. And then so, like, even just wording it, like I'm reading it and just trying to piece it together. It's just like, it's interesting because, like, logically, it wouldn't make sense from this point of view from the Pharisees. The Jews, the people that were so strict about the scriptures, failed to see this basically error, right? And then you know, that telling happened hundreds and hundreds, probably like 1,000 years ago before even Jesus came. So all this time, they thought that was like a viable critique or something that the Jews had, like, basically a one-up, and basically just fall flat with just a simple rhetorical question. Methods, right? How to prove it. And most of them are just very practical. I mean, just asking a rhetorical question, or just like basically doing it in a specific way where he always ties back into his nature, his character, and some of the things that have already been said, and then he just reaffirms it, right? He double downs on it. It's not like he's just repeating himself. He's really doing it in a way where, like, you cannot take it any other way. And so the only way that you can basically misinterpret it, right, of how Jesus didn't indirectly or subtly tell or basically reaffirm multiple times his divinity, you have to interpret it any other way but how Jesus did it to portray himself as God. Like, that's the only way. You completely miss it if you read it, and then instead of seeing how it's really evident, because it's a common external critique that John is the only one that portrays Jesus as God. It just does it more direct. The other ones, even with Mark 14 that I showed earlier, is basically a given. It's a given. The beginning and end of Mark, especially the chapters that they start with, it's there. Same thing with Luke, same thing with Matthew. Matthew is literally opens up with Jesus because God is our salvation. Like that's literally what the name stands for.